Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Gareth Metcalfe.
Hello.
And Elliot Morgan.
Hello.
It's fantastic to have you both back on the podcast, Gareth. I couldn't believe that it was November 2022 was the last time you were on. Feels like yesterday.
Is that right?
Yeah, I checked.
Wow. Okay. It's great to be back here. You do great work. So yeah, I'm really delighted to be back.
No, appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I think we were doing our two-part problem solving. I think we said we were possibly going to do a part 3, and I think that we maybe have that in the pipeline for some point down the road. But it's great to have you back. We're going to explore deconstructing word problems, which is something that you've actually been working on probably since 2022. You told me it was 3 years in a labour of love. What's going on, Gareth? What have you been working on?
Yeah, that might be why I've not been here for 3 years. I feel like I've disappeared into a hole for those 3 years. I feel like for a long time I've been talking about ways to break down worded questions, children to have more success in answering worded questions. And I've talked about the kind of big themes of that, covering up bits of information. So, for example, children can't give you an answer the moment they see the question. And I guess it's like the detail of, it's almost easy from someone in my position to say, here's one lovely example and here's how it works. And then for teachers just to have a lot to do themselves to try and outwork that vision. So what I've tried to do is kind of take the principles that I've been talking about and what does this look like on a consistent basis? So teachers have got the hopefully the pedagogy and the understanding of how it works, but also kind of more resources to take away and use. And I guess part of that process has been me taking the principles, constructing lessons, taking them into classrooms, discovering all the problems with them, rewriting them, and on that kind of ongoing process. And I guess, to be honest, it's probably taken a lot longer than I predicted it would. But yeah, I've really enjoyed the process and kind of taken a lot from it myself, I think.
Pupils do struggle with word problems, whether English is their first language or not. It's a big thing, and it's almost like, it's one of the indications that they understand the mathematics, but really it's something that can cause teachers and pupils alike a lot of stress because perhaps they're not as proficient as they might want to be, or as we might want our pupils to be. I don't know. I mean, what sort of kicked off the decision making? You think this is something I need to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just like from my own teaching experience as well, I mean, I think everyone has probably seen that mismatch between what you think the children should be able to do in answering worded questions and sometimes the proficiency in that. And so I guess it was something that I was interested in and a little bit exploring, well, what actually is best practice. And I guess the words of my old head teacher would always echo in my head, which would be, Gareth, what does it look like in the classroom? And I guess that was the thing that I really wanted to explore. And I felt like some of the aspects of the pedagogy are more straightforward for teachers just to pick up the word questions that they currently will use in lessons and make small adaptations to them. I mentioned about covering up a piece of information so children can't immediately answer the question. Another one might be if children are given pairs of questions with a subtle difference from one question to the next, and for them to appreciate the effect of the change in the wording from question 1 to question 2. But I guess I felt like that was something that needed quite a lot of attention in the task design. And I guess that's why I thought, well, that's a thing that I'd like to take on. And I guess it's been really interesting for me as well, all of the insights that I've taken from the teachers, the teaching assistants who sit alongside the children who are breaking down the tasks, kind of uncover all the shortcomings in the questions that I designed. So that process I found really intriguing. I guess it's felt to me like it shows how complex it is to give children success when it comes to breaking down worded questions, to really understand what it means to read a question carefully. So I guess that's kind of what's led me to really kind of follow this path.
You said there that it's like probably it feels easy for teachers to adapt questions they already have access to. What, in your experience, do you think are like common pitfalls that teachers, the traps that they fall into when they're trying to do that for their class? They've got a word problem, they're adapting it for their class, but what pitfalls are there when they're doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, that. So there's a couple of different elements to that, and I guess a couple of things that I've learned. So again, in terms of if I was covering up like little pieces of information for children to predict, or what's that information there that's hidden, I think one of the mistakes that I made, and perhaps I've come to see, has been if too much information is covered up, we often have too open a conversation about what it is that, what the missing information could be. And so sometimes one of the things I've come to is thinking about what is the key piece of information, what's the key understanding children need to have, and just focus their thinking on that aspect of the question. And linked to that, if I was then giving children follow-up, like sequences of questions to answer, it's having that awareness of what's the key thing I want the children to understand, and what's the key thing I'll vary from question to question, to, I guess, avoid what I'd consider the pitfall that I fell into previously, which is probably just giving children a word question and then giving them another word question, where there isn't necessarily any relationship to notice between those two questions. And so it's probably getting away from probably the traps would be, I'll show you a worded question, and then I'll give you an identical one to answer, where it isn't in any way a legitimate experience of problem solving. And then the other probably pitfall would be, here are two unrelated worded questions, and asking children to answer them, where of course they won't be able to connect those experiences, and it doesn't lead us to having any specific change in understanding. So I guess it's being aware of what the key ideas are, and then how I present and vary those key ideas, so children can kind of come to appreciate their importance.
I think before we met on social media and then sort of chatted on the podcast and things, the fact that you test your resources so diligently in classes was something, it was like part of your reputation that was sort of came before you, how hard you work to make sure that these things actually work in classes. And as you're speaking, I've got lots of questions coming, but I think it probably makes sense to outline sort of what the culmination of this work has been. So if I said deconstructed word problems, and I say year 2, what's the big picture? What can teachers, if they go to icmaths.com, what can they see? What will they sort of have? Is and does that have an approach that marries up with it, or is it standalone sort of resources?
Kieran, come in and correct me if I don't quite answer your question. So the big principles that I've been talking about for a while would be, like I've been mentioning, slowly revealing information in a question. So we take what might be a key piece of information in a question that might be hidden. It might just be one number is hidden. So children initially process the information in a question, and they're unable to answer it at that point, and then that information might be provided. One of the things that I think has been really interesting is modeling. So it's probably easy for me to say we want to model questions with equipment or images. And there's been a couple of things that I've learned in the way to model questions with equipment and images. And one of them is perhaps where I'd previously just show, here's a question and here's the solution. I want to make sure all the children actively engage in that thought process, and that I have some understanding of their level of competence there. So one of the little tweaks I might have now, or two examples. One would be, I'll bring up a question and then there'll be 2 images, and children have to think which image represents the question. So it might be which picture from in year 2. It might end up becoming which bar model represents the question. And so then I can ask the children to look at that, think about that, maybe have a discussion, they can vote on that. And I've got a sense of how clear the children's understanding is there. Something that this was a piece of advice a year 2 teacher gave me when I brought up a question and asked the children and I just said, represent this with counters. And when they came to represent it with counters, there was almost too much variance in the way that they were trying to do that. And her suggestion, which I found really helpful, was actually what you wanted to do is the question involved. I might even have written it down. Jen has 3 grapes. Jen has 1 grape less than Amy. How many does Amy have? And she's saying what you want the children to do is put down 3 counters for Jen, and then think about how many you need for Amy. So actually model for them. Like what you're going to do is you're going to have Jen, and Jen has got 3, and then Amy, and how many does Amy have? Show me that with counters. So it was being a little more specific about what we wanted children to do and the way that they would engage in that thinking when it came to the visual representations. then the connections between questions. So if I give an example, I've written an example down, and when I talked about what I call minimally different questions. Now, I like to make sure that there are connections between the different questions children answer for them to be able to spot those connections. And one of the things I talk about is minimally different questions. So let's say if I say Ben has 4 pens, Mo has 3 pens fewer than Ben, how many pens does Mo have? And the answer is 1. 4 subtract 3 equals 1. If I then switch the names around and the items, so Ben has 4 cups, Ben has 3 cups fewer than Mo, how many cups does Mo have? Then now I have to do 4 plus 3, even though the word fewer is still in the question. So it is, in this instance, it's recognizing that fewer doesn't always mean I need to subtract. Actually, the thing that I need to attend to is the order of the names, or to think about who's got more and who's got less. And then I guess one of the things that, one of the kickbacks that I guess you could have where it comes to worded questions is we could say, well, this isn't problem solving, because essentially it's a routine, it's a process, it's a routine process. And then one of the things I guess that I've been looking at is how can we then try and devise like non-standard, non-routine tasks around worded questions for children to kind of explore. So that's the thing that I hope to be able to offer. That's what I hope Deconstructing Worded Questions hopes to do, both in terms of the resources it gives, but just also in like the pedagogy that hopefully it will come to encourage as well.
I absolutely agree how integral the sort of visual representation should be in terms of modeling the word problem questions. For teachers who are thinking about how can I get that balance between making sure a student can problem solve independently and ensuring that I'm giving them the support they need to deconstruct word problems, what would be your advice to teachers who are thinking about trying to strike that balance between making sure the child can do it independently, but also supporting them through that process of deconstruction?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, that, because I think like we want children to have genuine experiences of problem solving, and where they can legitimately struggle and wonder and go through that discomfort to come out the other end. But I always think to enable them to do that, we obviously want to give them the tools to do that. Now, if I was to look at worded questions, as opposed to perhaps different problem-solving tasks, where me and Kieran could have a task and I might approach it one way and Kieran might approach it another way. I guess with word questions, I think the barriers to entry can be slightly higher, because there is one specific thing that both me and Kieran in this instance are likely to need to do to get there. And I always think if children are unable to answer that, I need to give them like sufficient examples around a question structure that will mean that when they come to a worded question, or it might be like a little variety of worded questions, they've got the tools to be able to go, well, for this one, it's this process, but for that one, I think I've got to do that, and to enable that thinking. And I think it's really right to say we want them then still to be given legitimate experiences of problem solving. So there needs to be enough variety in the questions that they're given, so that they then have to really think themselves. But then I guess it's kind of giving them the tools so they're able to do that thinking. And I guess that's been a bit the struggle for me as well in trying to create the lessons, has been our children given the tools to be successful, but will they then be able to take this, and then this will mean they'll be more successful when they're answering questions without the scaffold in the future. And of course that means that there's got to be some variation within that.
I was looking at your year 2 materials earlier, and I think they achieve exactly that, what you're saying. The way that everything you're saying just rings true of what I saw. Like, you're talking about it being sort of minimal steps, that they're being minimally different so that children can notice the patterns between them. There's this very gradual increase in progression. It was like finding numbers on a number line. Then it was saying like, oh, my number's in this section, so what number could it be? Then it was increasing the size of the number line and get them to apply that same understanding. Then it was, we're looking at odd and even numbers. And now you're saying, oh, my number fits in this section and it ends in a 9. So it's a really nice gradual progression to it. I think you're taking every child along the journey there. There's not, you're not disadvantaging those of like low prior knowledge or those who may struggle, because you're scaffolding it every step of the way to make sure they're feeling that success and they're going along that journey with their peers.
one thing that's interesting with that, yeah, and this is a thing that I hope is something that's slightly concrete to add into what you've mentioned, Elliot, is this idea of using redundant information. And this has been something that I think is interesting. So, and you'll have to forgive me if I get this slightly wrong, but I was in a school in Doncaster, and we were using one of the tasks, and one of the questions was something like, let's say it was Kieran has 5 red apples and 3 green apples. Each apple costs 10p. How many apples does Kieran have? And in doing so, often the children would, like, they routinely might think, I have to do something with those 3 numbers. And the idea that if we make it a normal thing, that there are pieces of redundant information in questions sometimes, then that's the instance where they've got to go, actually, in this instance, these are the pieces of information that I need. And I think it's having these norms for deconstructing problem solving that enable children over the long run to be successful. So that would be like one of the things that might be introduced in children's independent practice and would become a norm. So they get used to having to process information in a non-routine way, because that's obviously really important that they can do. But like you say, I think it's also really key that they've got the scaffolding so they can get used to it, unpicking a range of different types of problems, rather than there's just one problem that's suddenly presented to try and apply their arithmetic skill, which I think isn't going to give children the tools that they need.
I think it's huge because we know how distracting superficial information is, even as adults. If we read Dan Willingham and we got the problems of the soldiers in the general, we know that we don't do well whenever we're distracted by things. And, no more so is that true when you're a child. Even those people who don't struggle with mathematics and who really enjoy mathematics can be distracted by things. And I think being really explicit about the grammatical structure of the problem, and I think this might even be something we talked about when we explored problem solving, and how that connects to the arithmetic structure, is something I think every child needs or certainly deserves, because it allows them then to feel confident in many more situations. Because I think the idea of non-routine is really difficult in primary because we do so many word problems and we do so many, we do so much maths that I think finding those novel situations, those novel scenarios can be really difficult. But I think for me, at the very least, what I want is my pupils, my children, feeling confident when they sit down that they've got something in their back pocket that can help them if they feel stuck, perhaps distressed or like it is novel.
I've got a question for both of you then, based on what Kieran was just saying, and both of you being sort of math specialists. Do you think, so Kieran talked there about grammatical structure to a question and then sort of underpinning mathematical structure. In your experience, do you think that teachers perhaps overemphasize the grammatical structure? So the famous strategies of like rucksack, and do not spend enough time on elucidating the sort of mathematical structure to pupils that Gareth hinted at. Is that your experience? Do you think there's a balance there? Does it tip one way more than the other usually? What would you say?
The underlying idea is we've got to get the children to see the mathematical structure. And I think the danger, like, I think the reason that rucksack came to be was we wanted to be able to codify, well, what does it mean to be, what does excellence look like when it comes to answering, to problem solving and answering worded questions. And obviously what we need to do is look at what the detail is of reading a question, understanding a question. And again, I think like an overemphasis on specific words, that there are limitations within that. And I guess I think the art is, how do we expose the mathematical structure of the question, and what's the best way that we can ensure that children process that? And again, for me, it's like, do we have, or do schools have, this clear vision of this is our approach to being able to do this? This is what it looks like from class to class to class. And so being able to articulate what that approach is, I think, is really key. And again, I like to think the principles, the slow reveal where children then have to process the structure of the question, the modelling as being key, and giving children questions where there are connections between them, I think is a fantastic starting point. But yeah, I mean, I think a great summary is we want children to see the underlying mathematical structure of questions, and how do we really bring that to life? And I think that is the thing that really needs to be emphasized.
Gareth, you alluded it earlier on when we talked about the use of the word fewer. I think when I think of grammatical structure, I'm thinking about the order in which we phrase the question, because there can be really deliberate ways to distract. I'm thinking like the assumption is that all together will result in a sum, that kind of thing. But you could very easily use it in a way that, like you say, is superfluous to the problem. And so I've always spent time making sure pupils are really clear on the arithmetic structures, and so they know the distinction between augmentation and aggregation, because the context of the story or the word problem in general will, I think, more often than not, make it conclusive what your plan of attack is. And I think everybody's got an approach to solving, and it normally involves what's the important information, what's the superfluous information, what's my strategy, and then doing it. I mean, that's basically, Craig Barton has that in 3 steps, doesn't he? In How I Wish I Taught Maths. And I think they all boil down to a similar kind of approach. When you're looking at bar models and how useful bar models are, it's a case of, well, this isn't going to do the maths, but it's going to show me what I don't yet know, and typically what I don't know is what they're asking me for. So yeah, so I think in that, I wasn't necessarily thinking about sort of mnemonics and things like that there, but just that teachers being aware, teachers knowing that these are things that are important, if not, even if they're not explicitly stated in whatever national curriculum you're using. But that, quite often when we're utilizing almost like shortcuts, or sort of we're fast tracking things as we get closer to sort of standardized assessments into Key Stage 2. Really, if we start early on and we start in year 1 and we only work with numbers in 10, but we look at all those arithmetic structures, certainly the additive structures, and then in start of Key Stage 2, looking at multiplicative structures in a bit more detail. And that's sort of where I'm coming from in that. And that's what I really like about your work, Gareth, is that you can see the thinking you've done around that, and the sort of the fact that it's an expert making decisions. Because I think, even to go back, you mentioned, I have in the past taken your IC problems and asked them, and I'm sure I've told you this before, I've asked them, why has Gareth made that decision? And so it's almost thinking about that, but having these things in mind so that we know that when pupils get to year 6 or the end of primary, these things are familiar to them. I think I've gone sort of off piece there, Elliot. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I had in mind when I was mentioning those things. Is almost the, teachers having the awareness. I was trying to find the research paper because Nick Hart shared a few blogs about problem solving. This must have been 2020, 2021. And there was a Japanese researcher who looked at outlining what the grammatical ways to represent a problem were. And I think there might have been 14 different ways to ask all these different problems. And I find it really fascinating. So I'll try and share that in the show notes.
I think the thing that's interesting is when it comes to year 6, I think teachers will often think, right, we need to get the children to this level, and they can almost make quicker gains in improving children's arithmetic. And I think for children to be able to be successful in breaking down worded questions, I just think it's a slower burn and needs more of a consistent approach. I think it's a really difficult thing just for children just to pick up it, in a shorter period of time. And so I think it's really key for schools to think, this is our consistent approach in this area specifically.
A little bit earlier, you mentioned the almost like, I don't think you used the term story, but almost like the journey that pupils go on when they're engaging with a task or a sequence of questions. And I really like the paper 2006, Anne Watson and John Mason, where they outlined, it's almost like they were telling a story, and there was almost like a deceptive end that really made the people think. And they were working with teachers, and they lured them into this trap. And then there was this big surprise ending, which actually made them, I think they understood the maths more as a result. It's been a long time since I read this paper, but that's the residue that I've got. Does that ever come into your mind? I mean, when you're sequencing those questions, how are you thinking about them? Are you thinking about the whole thing? I mean, I would typically start at the end and then work backwards. What's your thought process when you're designing those tasks, Gareth? I've always wanted to ask.
Absolutely. It would be starting at the end and starting from, rather than just one question, I guess a question and its variants, if you like, and thinking that how do we get the children to be successful in answering this kind of family of questions, so to speak. So it'd be there working backwards from that, thinking about the different representations and how we get children thinking about those key ideas and what the choices are they're going to have to make. And yeah, and I really like that idea of like the surprise. And there are lots of times where we want children to make a prediction and then for them to experience a surprise. They thought it was going to be this, it was actually that. If I've got a couple of examples. So let's say like one more straightforward one, and then one that's maybe a little bit more involved. So let's say it was, I'd look at something very similar today. It's a really straightforward example I've shared a number of times. So let's say we say Kieran has 10 sweets, and then we cover up a line in the middle, and it says, how many sweets do Kieran and Elliot have altogether? And we say to the children, so what information's hidden? And they're going to say, it's the number of sweets Elliot has. And we say, is there anything else it could be? They say, no, it's definitely the number of sweets Elliot has. And so when they see it, it says, Elliot has 4 more sweets than Kieran. It's that, oh, it's not the thing that I thought it was. And that's trying to get them away from just adding 4 because it says 4 more. A slightly different example of that, if I was coming to a pair of questions, might be something. I'll go for your names again. So if it was, let's say Kieran has £20, Elliot has £8, then Kieran spent, and it's a blank box for children to fill in. Now they've got the same amount of money. I want the children to recognise Kieran spent £12. And then the next question is identical apart from, so Kieran has £20, Elliot has £8, and it says, Kieran gave Elliot blank box. Now they have the same amount of money. And it's recognizing that those two numbers won't be the same. It will, of course, it will be 6. It will be half of the 12 because if Kieran gives £6 and Elliot will have £6 more. And it's almost, if you like, the surprise comes in the power of the difference between spending and giving in this instance. And it's trying to really highlight, oh, look, this thing has that effect. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what the point that you made, but I think it's almost like trying to really, in bright lights, show the effect of these subtle differences. I think that's one of the ways we can really highlight we say to children, we want you to read the question. And I think that's an example of a way that we actually just illuminate the language that already exists kind of within the question. I remember one day, I was in South Manchester trialing a resource. It was just a great memory, to be honest, but we were breaking down a typical problem-solving structure. So it was like and forgive me because this again is coming a little bit off the top of my head, but if it was like, in total, Kieran and Elliot got £10, and Kieran's got £4 more than Elliot. And we teach the process for essentially breaking that down and looking at, we subtract that difference and then halve and so on. Now, that might not make any sense, but like we teach the process for answering that kind of question. And then the children answer these minimally different questions around that. And one child's able to see there's this subtle difference between the second to last and the last question. So the answer differs. And the second to last one is a whole number answer, and the last one's got a decimal answer. And then he's finished and he's reading his book. And this to me is like red rag to a bull. You know, he's in my maths lesson and he's reading his book. So I come over and I think this is the perfect moment for the bat and ball question. I don't know if you're familiar from Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about this question that a high percentage, like 50% of the undergraduates from, it might be from Harvard, from a prestigious American university, answered this question incorrectly, the bat and ball question. And it was, a bat and a ball costs £1.10. A bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And the typical wrong answer is to think the ball costs 10p. And to think of it as £1 and 10p, because of course then the difference between the bat and the ball would be 90p, not £1. And he just wrote down 5p and went back to reading his book. And it was just such a magic moment. But yeah, when children see that, and he had a little smile at me, a dismissive smile, and went back to reading his book, which I just thought was great.
I don't know if you've engaged with it much, Gareth, but your thoughts on teachers using like AI to create word problems and what your thoughts on that way? Obviously, it like depersonalizes it a little bit, but
I don't have personal experience of having used it to an enormous extent. that I could share. It was interesting because actually at the conference the other day, I forget the lady whose name who did the session on AI from the Oak Academy.
Oh,
And
Katie Morrow. Yeah, Katie.
yeah, and she was saying that it's not been as spot on yet for maths, but I think inevitably it will become really strong. Yeah, but whether I don't know if I have any enormous insight to share to add there. I haven't that much experience of using it yet. One of the things I think I need to get into that.
The rate of change
Yet.
is immense, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it's moving so fast. Yeah, Katie's great. And I know she's been doing a lot of thinking. I've seen studies where AI struggles with its times tables beyond 13
Yeah.
times 13, stuff like that there.
Yeah.
Well, I had one where I was making badges for my daughter's 10th birthday. And so it was like how many millennia old she is, how many centuries old she is, and go on, to how many seconds old she is. When I was calculating how old is she in days, it calculated it incorrectly because it missed one of the leap years. And I was like, I'm sure that's wrong. So yeah, I think there are little errors still.
Everyone listening will be thinking, okay, you've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about this. Sounds really, really interesting from a pedagogical approach. Now, obviously, it's really difficult with physical resources to get those across in the audio medium. So next week, you're very kindly going to do a standing room only talk, as we call them for the podcast, which we can direct everyone listening towards YouTube where they'll be able to see your resources in action. But how can they get the most? I'm a teacher, I'm a maths lead. How can I get the most from your deconstructed word problems materials? What's the plan of attack?
Yeah, so the design the deconstructing worded questions resources is to provide this really consistent lesson structure. And that's something that I've been working through. So this will be something that will work from year 2 to year 6. Now I'm adapting the year 6 resource so it will now fit with this lesson structure. So hopefully this is something that can become really consistent over the years for schools to be able to embed. And essentially it boils down to teaching a range of questions, then a discussion task, and then another build-up task, and then different independent tasks for children to complete. And then there's kind of an extension from there. I guess the thing that I would talk about in terms of the process of embedding the resources is actually getting children familiar with the techniques that are used. So I know that from the schools that I've worked with, whilst I hope that they present lessons that can be interspersed within units of work, probably later within a unit of work, I see the individual lessons being used. I know that at first, what a lot of schools have thought is we want to upskill the children in being used to seeing a slow revealed task where a piece of information is hidden, and we say, what could that be? And the children give an answer. We say, oh, that's interesting. Anything else it could be, or is it definitely that? And we get used to that as a pedagogy. We want to get the children familiar with the idea of them seeing pairs of questions and thinking, well, what's the same and what's different about this question as well? So I think there's an element to which we might need to actually model and have a look at some of the example lessons and get children trained up looking at these are the things we want you to notice when we're using the resources. And I know from schools that I've worked with, that's what they've done, is they've gone, we're going to train the children in spotting these techniques. I guess my vision is that either immediately or eventually we'll have these lessons where teachers can pick them up and they can go, this is going to really, really walk us through answering these worded questions and get us engrossed into these deep tasks. So I guess the answer to that is knowing that there is this consistent lesson structure, but first of all, for children to engage really successfully, it's maybe talking them through some of the familiar techniques, some of the things they want to think about or notice, almost picturing, what do I want the children to say? How am I going to ensure they're going to say that when I'm not there? So I guess particularly this school year, my encouragement to teachers, I guess, would be to have a look, not necessarily to think I need to do this as a whole, but just almost get yourself familiar with the techniques that are there, how they could be kind of outworked in the classroom. Because to some extent, I in this instance, have got the curse of knowledge in a sense that I've been living with this for 3 years and I have this picture of how it looks for me. And it's just become very familiar for me to outwork that. So staff, our teachers feeling like this is something they can practice with, certainly in this academic year, I hope is something that'll be really useful. So in the long run, it can be something that's just a really kind of normal part of teaching practice.
So it's almost like part of the wider sequence. And these deconstructed word problems are almost interspersed throughout the term, throughout the year. Am I interpreting that correctly? Because obviously you've got
Yes.
there's like the build up section, and then there's task A and there's task B, and that's almost that structure the consistent structure you're talking about. But how did you choose the content? Was it just here are all the situations in which you might solve word problems, or did you really refine in what you chose and how frequently that sort of occurs within the resources?
Yeah, it was really looking throughout the different aspects of the curriculum and looking at, well, these are the common worded questions that will come up in each of those units. And so let's say we've been doing some work on subtraction, and there's a lesson around difference. And so hopefully that will naturally just fit within that unit, and teachers will be able to consider, well, where will this lesson fit within this unit? And so the tasks themselves span right across the maths curriculum. So hopefully it's just a case of teachers having a look and thinking, I can see that for us to really understand, almost to apply what we've learned and to understand this concept, I'll build this lesson in this phase of the unit, usually towards the end of the unit. So yeah, I see the lessons essentially being interspersed within the teaching sequences. The other hope and expectation that I would have is there'll be elements of the practice. So what essentially I'm talking about is standalone lessons using my resources. But what I envisage as well is that this will change, or my aim is that this will change how teachers on a day-to-day basis and children attack the word questions that they see. So then when you come across a word question in the resources that you currently use, teacher might think, I'm just going to hide that and ask the children what that could be. Or even we have a look at a question and we can write one very similar question to that and ask the children to compare them. So my hope is that it provides resources that can be really used, but it also gets teachers and children into these thinking routines that can kind of have that wider application.
I'm definitely going to try and support that as best I can, because I'm 100% with you. It's the thinking about the task that we both set and are set for us as pupils. And a lot of the time I'll hear from teachers who say, the pupils who struggle with maths don't get to do the word problems, or everyone in the class is almost flying through them as quickly as they possibly can. And that defeats the purpose, because they are these immense moments for consideration of these mathematical truths, aren't they? So, I'm on Team Gareth as far as this is concerned. This sounds like music to my ears. It's more thinking deeply. It's that 80% of our time that spend time thinking about this stuff. And, I'm 100% on board.
It might even just train the children up in terms of they've finished the 3 questions, and we don't want them then to go on to the next thing necessarily, but it might be them noting what was the similarity and difference between question 2 and question 3. Why is the answer to question 3, insert pattern relationship, and for them to really note that, and for that to become the new routine, that the reasoning is embedded there. So yeah, and I hope this doesn't span just my resources, but it becomes a thing that then just becomes a natural part of children's pattern of thinking when it comes to worded questions.
Fantastic. I mean, if anyone listening can't wait, if they go to icmaths.com/DECONWQ2, they will find a short 2-minute video where you explain this with images, which obviously we haven't got the luxury of. But next week, like I say, you'll be back and you're going to talk us through this in almost like a CPD session, but with examples and stuff. So I think you've done a really good job to help us understand, sort of see where you're coming from, and I think people will be very excited to see what you've got in store for us next week. All that's really left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Gareth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thank you.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.